Perception. Part 1. Perception. In light of finishing up critical thinking, meditated on it, and this is a pretty logical step to take to move into perception. And I taught this series a few years ago. I was where I was at. I've grown since then, so there's a lot more things I can add to this thing. The key phrase that you want to remember through this whole series of perception is the way that you perceive God is the way you receive God. And you can insert anything in there, and we will. The way you perceive your friends is the way you receive your friends. The way you perceive your enemies is the way you receive your enemies. The way you perceive yourself is the way you receive yourself. All of these things factor into how we relate. It's our perception. And it's simple, but there's deeper concepts that we need to dig into. If you think somebody's arrogant, you will receive them as if they are arrogant, whether they are or not. If you think somebody's mean, not saying that they aren't, but you tend to receive them that way. And when you receive somebody that way, you actually heighten that characteristic that you're expecting to get. You actually amplify it. And that's where the danger is. And that's what we have to do as believers, is be careful of that danger. I don't care if somebody's arrogant or mean or all these other facets. If I don't take a step back from myself and am willing to receive them from a neutral position, or looking deep into the Spirit and finding out how I'm supposed to receive them, then I'm missing the mark on interacting with the people around me and with myself. Do you understand that? If we already have preconceived notions about a person, then we have a bias about that person, and then it's harder for us to see something else about that person that may not be evident. So we just take them at face value. And that's one of the main things about perception. God says, you look on the outside, I look on the heart. Jesus echoed that phrase. Jeremiah records it. He says, man judges the outside, but God looks at the heart and judges a man according to what his deeds deserve. He looks at the heart first. Where are the scars? Where are the wounds? Where are the hurts in the heart before he judges the outward actions coming out of the overflow of that heart? Jesus said, out of the overflow of the heart, the mouth speaks. Well, then you have to understand the heart before you just judge the words coming out, correct? So how you perceive somebody is how you receive somebody. One of the definitions of perception from Webster's 1828 is the act of perceiving or receiving impressions by the senses, or that the act or process of the mind by which it makes something known. It's that process of interpreting what you're getting. Now, as believers, Spirit-filled believers, we need to look deeper and say, all right, I can see with my, or get with my five senses what I can get. But what's deeper here? And that goes back to this God kind of perception, this intellect, this understanding or knowledge, being able to see. Not a worshiping at the tree of knowledge type thing, but a knowing, a gnosis, a being able to see what's really going on there. You don't have to know all the facts about somebody in order to know somebody. You can know them. One of the other definitions from the online Merriam-Webster current definition, and I like some of these, a lot of modern definitions are revisionist ideas. But there's a few now and then that bring a little bit more clarity than some of the ancient definitions. This is one of them that I found. An observation or mental image. An observation or a mental image. The perception. Your observation or mental image. What is your observation or mental image of a person before they even step foot in your presence? What have you heard about this person? What have you heard about that person? What's your mental image? That goes back to some of the things I taught on the imagination series. How powerful our imaginations are. How we form these images. And it goes back to the first 2 commandments where it says, don't have any gods before me, don't have any graven images. The first 2 most important commands that God gave was, one of them focused specifically on have no graven image. Don't create or manifest within yourself some image of me, because then you'll limit the true perception of who I am. The minute we start forming mental images of who we think God is, without leaving, that doesn't mean we don't try to find certain elements that we can grab hold of, but it's like this. If I look at a diamond and I see one facet and it fluoresces a certain way and I fixate on that and that's all I'm going to see about that diamond, instead of turning the diamond over and seeing another facet and then turning it again and seeing another facet and seeing another and putting it in different light. We were watching a show the other day and there was a gentleman buying emeralds. And he looked at this emerald and he was looking for a certain characteristic and a certain quality, and he just kept looking at it and looking at it and looking at it, and he said, no, I'm going to pass on that one. And the lady that was selling it, trying to sell it to him, she picked it up and she said, okay, no big deal. And she walked away. And as she walked away, he said, right when she picked it up and began to turn, the light hit it in a way that hadn't hit it before, and it fluoresced just right. And he saw that element that he'd looked for. But while he held it, he couldn't see it. But until somebody else held it, and it turned just right, it was just far enough away from him, turned just right, the sunlight hit it just right, and it fluoresced. And he saw that characteristic. And he tried to stop her and say, okay, no, wait, I'll buy it from you, I'll buy it from you. And it was too late. She was already heading out the door. And he was on the program saying he lamented that he missed that thing because he hadn't seen what he was looking for, that certain characteristic and quality. And that's what I'm saying about God, is that we can get the idea that God's a diamond. We can say he's that gem, that precious item that we're looking at. But don't get fixated on one facet alone within that. That's what I'm saying about understanding God. Your perception. Your perception has to be open to see other facets. But understanding at the same time, I grasp the totality of God in this grand scheme. You understand that? Because that'll help you to see yourself. You can't just label yourself, well, I'm such and such. You know, guy changed the light bulb here this morning that went out. Well, we don't label Guy as the light bulb changing guy. He's much more than that, even though that is a facet of capability, a lower, very small purpose that just about any of us could do in here, I'm pretty confident. Okay? But it's still something he's able to do. But that doesn't mean that's all he's able to do. In Acts chapter 17, Paul is in Athens and he's speaking to the people there. He walks through and he sees all these idols, and it says he became very distressed. And we get into this part, and this is one of the verses that I've loved for a long time, because it speaks to this idea of how our mind thinks. Are we critically thinking about things? Are we looking at God and challenging the assumptions that have been handed down to us about God? Are we discovering what's really there? Or are we just being spoon-fed what they're giving us and not realizing that there's a little bit of cyanide mixed in it, and it's poisoning us slowly? And that's not to say that people that are spoon-feeding it, the majority of them aren't well-intentioned. But as a phrase you can pretty well rely on, is the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Good intentions don't get us going. Obedience is what gets us into purpose. And obedience comes down to not just a blindly following orders. It's an interaction and a relationship with God and hearing what you're supposed to do, what you were created to do, and stepping into that purpose. I don't want to just blindly be obedient to God. I want to step into my purpose. And we call that obedience because that's a somewhat of a lower level understanding of the process. But really what it is if I was created to do this, and God says, this is my will for you, but that's actually really my perfect purpose is to do the will of God, then I'm also doing my perfect will as well. I'm doing God's perfect will and my perfect will. because when we get together, they're actually one and the same. The perfect purpose for my life is the will of God. And being obedient to my perfect purpose is being obedient to God, but it's also being obedient to the perfect purpose that He created me to be. So it works hand in hand, and it takes it somewhat out of this realm of just going, I'll do exactly what you tell me to do. Type of lordship thing. This type of the perception that you just do exactly what God tells you to do, and whatever some man who claims to represent God tells you to do, that's what you need to be doing. You better do this or God's going to come and get you. And that's not the right perception. And I'm speaking in generalities here, you understand? When I'm talking about obedience and stuff like that. Don't get on a tangent and start going. What I'm saying is that when you step into your purpose, it contains all of that. It contains being obedient to God. Because God's not doing something that's contrary to who He created you to be. God's giving you something that's exactly what you were created to be. And all of this ties back into perception. How do you perceive yourself? Do you perceive yourself as a failure, as making mistakes, as never able to achieve what you're supposed to achieve, as always coming up short? Then that's how you're receiving yourself. If you see yourself like that, if you see yourself as a failure, then you're going to continue to project failure out of yourself and continue to fail. And it goes back to what Paul talked about in Romans when he said, the things I want to do, I don't do. The things I don't want to do, I do. Why? Because I've allowed error to live in me. And something I was meditating on before I got started up here, one of the things that the Lord spoke to me about, and it was fairly interesting about this idea that He said error doesn't, that's the root of sin. Sin, the actual word hamartia, means to miss the mark, to err, to not have a share in, to not have an inheritance in, okay? But missing the mark or erring, what he said to me was, doesn't mean that it was necessarily you. Meaning, there are times that you've been around situations where the situation itself caused you to be in error. Doesn't mean that you were purposely looking to let error flow out of you. You were in a situation and error occurred around you and you fed into it. You didn't resist it well enough. And that's what it says in Hebrews when it says, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Hebrews chapter 12, where it says, fix your eyes on Jesus, the author and perfecter of your faith, who for the joy set before Him endured the cross, scorning its shame, sat down on the right hand of the throne of God. Consider Him who endured such opposition, because in your struggle against error, you've not resisted to the point of shedding your own blood. We haven't resisted to that point. There are things that we get dragged into. The next thing that the Lord said to me about this error is that what we do, here's the thing. If you were out at a target range and you were shooting arrows at a target range and you kept missing the mark, which is the term hamartia, you kept missing the mark, at some point that's going to become very costly. If you were out trying to shoot game, a deer or something like that, and you kept missing, it's going to be costly. Because in that thing, you're not just missing the target, you're going to spook the animal and not get the kill. So that becomes more and more costly the more you miss the mark, the more you allow that error to live in you. Okay? So the thing is, the more we allow error to live in us, no matter how much we desire to get the shot right, we're going to be limited in that. So the point is removing the error. It goes back to what I was saying, or started to say in Acts chapter 17, verse 29. Therefore, since we are God, we should not think that the divine being is like gold, silver, or stone, an image made by man's design and skill. In the past, God overlooked such ignorances, but now He commands all people everywhere to repent, think differently. To metanoeo, to think differently. He commands all people everywhere to think differently. In the past, God overlooked it. And the interesting thing about this is it says the word overlooked actually means, it's a compound word, and it actually means in behalf of and to see. To see in behalf of. So when it says overlooked, it's not getting the exact, like God just ignored it. That's kind of the perception you get when you say God overlooked it. He just, I'm not going to pay attention to that. When you actually look at the compound word, the two elements, it really means God chose to see in behalf of you. And that goes back to God looks at the heart, man looks at the outside. It wasn't that God just ignored what was going on. He chose to see it in light of lack of knowledge, lack of knowing. In fact, that's what the ignorance, that word ignorance there in the passage means. Agnoia. Metanoia, that's what they translate repentance, which is an incorrect translation. Metanoio, to think differently. Meta, where we get metamorphosis. Metanoio, noio of the mind. So when it says agnio, A-G-N-O-I-A, agnio, it's opposite of knowing, opposite of the mind, not knowing. That's where we get the word ignorance. Ignorance doesn't mean that you're stupid or unintelligent. It just means you don't know something. Well, in the past, people didn't know God, didn't have that capacity to know God. So he says, in the past, I looked at the heart, and I realized they didn't have the opportunity and capacity because of the fall of man and everything that was going on to truly know me the way I wanted them to know me. So I overlooked things. I looked at them through that perspective. In behalf of, I saw them in behalf of their flaws. I believe it's David who wrote, "You know me, Lord. You know that I'm dust, and you have mercy on me because of it. Remember me. Remember that I'm just dust." And I'm paraphrasing. You can look that up. I believe that's in the Psalms. I know it's in the Psalms, but where exactly, I didn't write it down. Perception and observation, a mental image. When we look over here, I've always loved this passage ever since the Lord showed it to me, that in the end of verse 29, an image made by man's design and skill. Now, because Paul listed out gold, silver, and costly stone, we automatically think of that outward, physical, earthly manifestation, man's design and skill. But when he uses the term image, then you have to go back to that progression. Where did the image originate? The image originated in the mind, in the imagination of the person. It had to originate there first before it could be manifested in silver, gold, or costly stone. It had to be conjured within the mind. That perception within the mind before it could be manifested in the earth. That's why this passage, when Paul's speaking to these people, he's saying, you shouldn't think the divine being is like this. He could have said, if he was just focused on the physical, you shouldn't see the divine being as this, or all of these idols. But he didn't say that. He said you shouldn't think the divine being is like these idols. And he gets into more aspect of it, because he goes into, before it actually, he goes into it in verse 27, he said, verse 26, he's talking about how God set the right places for everyone to live. Verse 27, he says, God did this so that men would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him, though he's not far from each one of us. And verse 28 was what I wanted to point out. For in him we live, move, and have our being, as some of your own prophets have said, we are his offspring. He says, in him we live, move, and have our being. So why do you look at these stone idols, these silver idols, gold idols, idols with precious stones on them, and think that God is like that? It doesn't move. It doesn't talk. It doesn't have any... All the characteristics of an idol are the characteristics you ascribe to that idol within the physical image. You have a physical image of something, and everything else that's ascribed to it is your imagination being placed on that thing. It has no unique characteristics of its own because it's not alive. And Paul's pointing out to him, he says, even some of your own prophets have said, we are his offspring. In him we live, move, and have our being. Don't you get this? And then he says to them, we shouldn't think, therefore, since you realize that you are mobile and can do things and think. And going back to the phrase of, I think, therefore I am. Because you have this mental cognition going on inside of you. Why do you look at this this physical idol, this fake thing, and think that that's somehow a God. That's not a God. That's not the God. And he says, therefore, since we are God's offspring, we shouldn't think that the divine being is like this. We shouldn't think. He's constantly going back to the mind. We shouldn't know ill or no way. Both the different tenses of the word. We shouldn't think the divine being is like this. He's not made by man's design and skill, but yet we keep making God with our own design and skill. And the problem is that our skill and our designs are lacking. And as long as our skills and designs are lacking, then we won't see God as God is. And we won't see ourselves as we are. And we won't see each other as we're supposed to see each other. We won't see all the facets of who that person is. We'll only see this singular thing that we're focused on. We will only see this bitter aspect of how that person hurt me over here, and so that's all I can see about them. We won't see all the other elements. And if we don't see them, then we cannot help that person see it themselves. Sometimes what needs to happen is you being able to see all the facets of a person and then getting around them and letting them know subtly, however it is, through love, walking with them hand in hand, that you see more than they see. And when you see more than they see, hopefully they'll start seeing it. And when they start seeing it, they start changing into it. Start to become who they are. That's why I proclaim all the time, there's nothing bad inherently within each and every individual. Things may be wicked, they may be twisted, which may cause us to do evil things, to toil, to work toward things that are not our purpose. But those characteristics within us are not inherently wrong. They're just twisted. So we need to untwist them. You know, there are people that are angry because they're not connected with God. Not that they're not connected with... They're not angry because they're not connected with God. They're angry, and their anger is misguided because they're not in a relationship with God. And yet if they get in a relationship with God, you could see that person turn that anger over to God and have it untwisted, and it become a righteous indignation for the things of God. See, we look at all these aspects and we think that they're evil. Just automatically. We don't understand what evil means. Evil means the root of evil is to toil. We don't understand what wickedness means. Wick comes from the same word as wick, where we get wicker, or the wick for a candle. It means to braid or twist together. When we untwist things, we're unwicking them. We're untwisting them. You're straightening it out. What does it say in Proverbs chapter 3? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He'll make your path straight. He'll straighten it out. He'll untwist it. He'll unwick it. He'll take that wickedness and make it righteous. Righteous, the condition of him who is as he ought to be. We get into these things, and we've got a certain perception of God. And that perception dictates our relationship with God. And then we have a certain perception of ourselves and others around us, and it dictates how we operate with them. And we're missing out on all these other things that are available in our personalities, in our makeup, in who we are. And if we would look at who we really are, if we would take this area of critical thinking and challenge the assumptions. Well, somebody told me that this person's such and such, but I'm going to challenge this assumption. Now, I have to bring out the caveat that doesn't mean that you run around trying to tell everybody who you think they are. I'm talking about when you're in a relationship with somebody. Are you in that relationship for your own self-gratification or for their edification, for building them up? And understanding where they're at. Let's look at another one. In Romans chapter 14, I wanted you to see a concept here that Paul points out. Verse 14. He's talking about weak faith and strong faith. Actually, verse 1, it says, "Accept him whose faith is weak without passing judgment on disputable matters. One man's faith allows him to eat everything, while another man whose faith is weak eats only vegetables. The man who eats everything must not look down on the man who does not, and the man who does not eat everything must not condemn the man who does, for God has accepted him. There's a perception change right there. Right in that passage, there's a perception change right there. You've got, fine, be in that weak faith. You've got strong faith, fine, be in that strong faith. Don't fight with each other over it. Let that go, and you be mature over here where you need to be. Don't beat each other up because you're not in the same place. You can't beat a 2-year-old that hasn't been potty trained for going in their diaper. That's where they're at. You haven't trained them yet? Fine, then do that. You can encourage them to change, but that's where they're at. You can't take a 2-year-old and expect them to do the work of a 20-year-old. They don't have the capacity. So you're not supposed to pass judgment. Not supposed to bring criticism. Now the verse that I wanted you to see was later on in verse 14. Well, it continues in verse 13. It says, "Therefore let us stop passing judgment on one another. Instead, not to put any stumbling block or obstacle in your brother's way." Judging them puts obstacles and stumbling blocks in their way. How do we do that? What makes us put stumbling blocks and obstacles? Our perception of them. It's one thing to just look at somebody and see that they're not doing something that you know you can do. It's another thing to begin to judge them for not doing what you know you can do. Leave it alone. If the opportunity comes up, discuss it, maybe help them grow in it, but don't pass judgment on them and just beat them up for it. That puts a stumbling block in them. They haven't reached that place yet. They haven't grown into that area yet. And that's not excusing things away, that's understanding the heart of that person. Verse 14 is what I wanted to get to. "As one who is in the Lord Jesus, I am fully convinced that no food is unclean in itself. But if anyone regards something as unclean, then for him it is unclean." And here's the concept I want you to get. The actual word unclean there really would be better translated as common. If someone considers something common, then for him it is common. But either way, the concept here is, if somebody around you thinks that something's a certain way, then for them it is that certain way. And if we get this perception now, we understand this, we take it in right now and say, wait a minute. Part of the reason that I see things the way that I do is because I want to see them the way I see them. Not because it's totally accurate. I'm considering that thing common, therefore to me it is common. It's not that it's common. It could be, it might not be. Either way, your perception is limiting any other option. To the man who considers something common, for him it is common. If anyone regards something as unclean, to him it's unclean. And that's how we are with our perceptions. And we've never been given the tools, the critical thinking tools, to say, I have to challenge the assumptions within me. Do I have to go through, the 7 assumptions that I listed out during that critical thinking teaching myself? Do I need to go through those and find out, am I making an assumption out of familiarity? Am I making an assumption out of historical data that I've been given, or out of my society, out of my workplace, the things that I do, the job that I do? Am I making these assumptions because of my upbringing, my childhood? Whatever it is, stop and take a minute and say, am I making these assumptions? Because you can begin to point them out. Were you abused as a child by a parent? Chances are you look at God as an abusive parent. Were you hurt by a friend when you were younger in your childhood? Chances are it's difficult to see God as your friend if you haven't worked through these things. You automatically make an assumption. There's a psychological term called transference. It means when you've been hurt in one relationship, when you get into the next relationship that's similar, the same dynamics, you tend to transfer the same things. In layman's terms, we call that baggage. We carry in the baggage into the next relationship. The psychological term is transference. It means you haven't dealt with the things of the past relationship, so now you're bringing them into this relationship. And you would be amazed at how many couples destroy their own relationship with each other, not because of the two of them, but because of the baggage that the two of them have brought from previous relationships. And it comes back to this idea of perception. I perceive you as wanting to hurt me. So therefore, when you do certain things, whether they're meant to hurt or not, I receive it that way. Because I was hurt before in a past relationship. And the person may plead and say, but I'm not that person that you were with. I don't do that. They say, but that was always done to me and you're not going to do it to me. Okay, I wasn't intending to do that. Well, it felt like you were trying to do that. Really? Have you ever been around people and heard that? Or said it yourself? Okay, that's where it's coming from. It's coming from our perceptions. It's coming from the baggage that we're carrying around with us. And in the past, I would put it this way, according to Acts, in the past, that can be overlooked. That can be understood. But once it comes to the surface, once it's revealed, it's not just God saying it, but the people around you saying, you know you deal with this. Yes. Okay, well, in the past, I loved you, and I still unconditionally love you, but you know this now. You know this characteristic about you. Yes, I know this characteristic. Okay, then you need to be careful or be aware of how you're interacting with other people, because you now know that you have this baggage in your life. You have these assumptions in your life, and it's causing you to receive people improperly because you're fearful of being hurt by them. You're jealous of their relationship with somebody else and not doing something for you, or whatever the case may be. Your perception is altered, therefore your reception is altered. You can't interact properly because you're waiting for them to hurt you. You're waiting for them to do something wrong. Or you're waiting for them to do something right, and when they don't do it, then you get mad at them for that. Well, you did such and such for somebody else. Yes. Why don't you do it for me? Different person, different circumstances. I did it because of these reasons. Don't make an assumption that because you're another person that I interact with that I have to do the same things with you. I work very, very hard at interacting with everybody that I know on an individual, personal basis. Because they're an individual. I tease certain people the way I tease them. I don't tease other people. There's some people that I make a point of not teasing at all because it would hurt them. I understand that. There's certain people I tease in certain ways. There's certain people I don't tease at all. There's some people I really tease because it gets them just right. They like it. It shows them that attention of where they're at. It's all about perceiving people. There are times when I sense that I did something with one person and somebody else saw it and their heart longed for it. And I'll say, Lord, I know they saw that and I know they desire to have that same interaction. And I've literally had them on several occasions tell me not to do it. Not to interact with them the same way. And I go, why, Lord? And He says, because they've got to work that thing out. When you interact with somebody and they are neutral in it, their reception of it, they can take it or leave it. They enjoy it while it's going on, but when it's over, they're not dependent upon it. That's a fun thing to do. You interact with somebody like that. And then you can turn over and try to do the same thing with somebody else, and because their perception is off, because their heart's not right in that area, they'll take it wrong. And they'll either try to become dependent upon it and monopolize your time, or whatever the case may be. And I'm speaking in a lot of great generalities, but I believe that you're getting the concept. I can't act the same way that I act with everybody, because somebody will misinterpret what I'm doing and not be able to properly react with my interaction with them. And it all comes back to this idea of perception. And perception is grounded on all these things. And I love this point that Paul's making in Acts chapter 17 when he says, think differently. Change your mind. It's not repent. Repent means to feel bad. He wasn't saying feel bad. He's saying you shouldn't think that the divine being's like this. You shouldn't think that out of man's design and skill. You shouldn't think. Now think differently. How do I think differently? And here's the biggest key to this whole part. How do I think differently? Because God's poured out His Spirit upon all flesh and made it available. The information is there. The understanding is there. Paul prayed it out of Ephesians, and he said, I pray that you would have a spirit of wisdom and revelation to know Him better. I pray you would have a spirit of wisdom and revelation to know Him better. Fulfilling that prophecy out of Joel, when Peter stood up and he says, He's going to pour out His Spirit in the last days upon all flesh. The NIV tends to say it all people, but really it's that same word in the Greek. It's the same word flesh. I can't say sardox. Is that how it says it? I can't remember how. You can look it up. But it's the word, it literally means flesh. So it's not just human flesh, it's on the entire planet. God said, I'm going to pour out my Spirit upon the whole place. That's the interesting thing. It's one thing that we misunderstand as Spirit-filled believers, and another thing that we get as Spirit-filled believers. We get that God poured out His Spirit and made it available, and we can be filled with the Spirit and the gifts and signs following, and we can have this deep, intimate interaction with God, but we also don't realize that God poured out the same Spirit upon all of them. Upon all of them. Now, it's one thing to be filled inside, and another thing to have God poured out on the outside. But my point is that there are people out there today that don't know God, that God's speaking to and teaching. You say, how is that possible? Verse 28. I read it to you. Or verse 27. God did this so that men would seek Him and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him, though He's not far from any of us. Let me read the context a little bit higher. Verse 24. God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth, and does not live in temples built by hands. And He is not served by human hands as if He needed anything, because He Himself gives men life and breath and everything else. From one man He made every nation of men, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and He determined the time set for them and the exact places where they should live. He did all that. God did all this so that men would seek Him and perhaps reach out to Him and find Him, though He's not far from all of us. God sets people in the right places, and He speaks to them, and He guides them, and He gets them to these places, and they don't even know it's God. They don't understand they're being used by God, and His hope at the core of it is that they would seek Him and know Him. But that doesn't mean He's not speaking to them because they don't know Him. He's still speaking to them. He did it. One of the huge examples is Cain. Was Cain seeking God? Yeah, he brought an offering, but he brought it with the wrong heart, and he was envious of his brother and eventually killed him. But God still reached out to him and said, Cain, where's your brother? And there are people out there today that God is speaking to all throughout the world. I've shared this with you before. I asked the Lord, I said, Lord, how do you talk to non-believers, people that don't know you? He said, it's so much easier than talking to you guys. I said, why? He said, because they don't battle within themselves. Is this God? Am I hearing you right, Lord? Is that you? Is this you? They just have a thought that comes in their mind, and they don't automatically go, well, that's not my thought, so that must be God. They just have a thought that comes in their mind, and they go, I'm going to go do that. He said, so I can speak to them all the time. I speak to them and interject the thought. But that's also on the flip side how the enemy can speak to them, how the devil can speak to them. Come up and whisper a thought, and they'll do that. So you'll see him on one hand, and I've witnessed it. I've witnessed a non-believing person on one hand speak the literal words of God out of their mouth, and then the next minute just be as wicked as they could be. And I watched that situation, and I thought, they're just an empty vessel. And God can speak over here. And what's His purpose? What's God's purpose? hopefully they'll seek me. Hopefully they'll look back on that and say, you know what? I remember that one time, man, I was drunk out of my mind. But all of a sudden, I just heard these words come out of me and I spoke them to this person. I don't know where that came from. And there's where investigation comes in, because they go, I don't know where did that come from? I need to investigate where that came from. And God says, that was me. I was trying to get your attention. We don't see all these facets. We think that the people out in the world are just blind and ignorant and just purposefully resisting God. It's their perception. It's because they don't have these tools of critical thinking and be able to challenge the assumptions. They told me God is such and such. But I've been talking to you for a while, Lord, and I don't really see that. So is this right or wrong? Or can we talk about? Absolutely, let's talk about this. And you'll find out there's a huge depth beyond what we've been given. The shallow, empty traditions that we've been given in the church. There's such a depth in God that we need to dig into on a regular basis. Just in casual conversation, to change our perception. Because when we change our perception, we change our reception. How you perceive God. The mental image you have of God is how you receive God. If you think that God is an angry God ready to pounce on you the minute you make a mistake, then that's how you receive God. The minute you make a mistake, you run in the garden and try to put sew some fig leaves together and cover yourself. Because you messed up. But you don't perceive and understand that you messed up 1,000 times and didn't even get it. You messed up 1,000 times, didn't even know you messed up, and God didn't say a word to you. And now all of a sudden you're going to freak out because you did this one thing that you finally figured out you did? We've got a shallow understanding of who God really is. We've got to take a step back and say, all right, Lord, can I suspend my assumptions, my perceptions of who I think you are, and let you really show me daily on a regular basis who you really are, what your nature is, what you're about. Because in understanding what God, the nature of God, you begin to understand your nature, and vice versa. God will show you something about yourself, and then you'll see, okay, God, I see how you are in this area. And then God will show you something about himself, and then you'll see how you are. It works hand in hand. However the Lord needs to do it, he'll say, do you see this about yourself? This is how I am. Do you see this about me? This is how you need to be. Because that's who I really created you to be. Wow. And you keep growing in that. That's perception. I'm perceiving God. I'm going to get into some of these other definitions in the next part. But one of the definitions is a consciousness. That's kind of an obsolete term. In fact, it lists as an obsolete term in the definitions there. Another one, the physical sensations in light of experience. Now, I love that one. We'll get into that one in the next parts. The physical sensation, judging the physical sensations in light of past experience. That's the core of what I'm talking about. We judge physically what we're looking at in light of past experience. You ever been bit by a dog? Next time you come in contact with a big dog, you're automatically fearful. Unless you've dealt with it. If you haven't dealt with it, you're automatically, can you keep that dog away from me? Why? Because I was bit before. Doesn't mean my dog's going to bite you. Yes, but I've been bit by a dog like that before, so I don't want to. Okay. But you see that's they're judging, they're seeing it in light of past experience. And like I said, I want to get into that one real deep. Another one that I'll give you just before we go. Quick, acute, intuitive recognition. What does that mean? The capacity for comprehension. The capacity for comprehension. I don't have to know everything. I have to be capable of comprehending. How do I do that? The number one way we do that as believers is being connected with the Spirit of God. You're filled with the Spirit. It says he who joins himself to the Lord is one with him in spirit. My spirit's connected with God's Spirit. Your spirit's connected with God's Spirit. So how do we do it? Instead of taking what my 5 senses are dictating to me that I need to take, I can stop and say, Lord, what do I need to see here? And it goes back to some of the things I've taught you before. The disciples walked up to the temple and they said, Master, what magnificent stones. Look at the temple and how awesome it is. And Jesus says, not one stone will remain upon another. Every one of them will be torn down. And they were like, They didn't see that because they were looking presently, at that present moment, looking at that structure. Jesus saw by the Spirit the future of that structure. And they did that exact thing. The Romans, when they sacked Jerusalem in 70 AD, they did that exact thing. Now, why did they take every stone off of every stone? Because the inside of the temple was inlaid with gold. And the only way to get all of the gold out of the seams was to tear every stone apart to get all of the gold out of the seams. So they literally tore it down, every seam off there. And the Wailing Wall that they have now in Jerusalem is nothing of the temple. It is the foundation wall. Best that they can come up with. This is just a foundational wall for the base of where the temple used to be. Just a retaining wall. It's not even any part of the original temple, but it's still so sacred to them. But the point is there's nothing left. That's my point. All they've got is the Wailing Wall. That's not even the temple. They've got nothing left. Jesus saw that before it happened. How do you see that? By the Spirit. Since the day of Pentecost, we all have access to one and the same Spirit. As Paul writes over and over again in Romans and 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, we have access to that one and same Spirit. When you're filled with the Spirit, that's why he wrote in Ephesians, said, be filled with the Spirit. That's a be being filled in the Greek. It's a continual infilling of the Spirit. Why? Because you're continually replenishing and refreshing the God information within you that supersedes the five senses information and allows you to see in the spirit realm the way you're supposed to see and perceive your purpose and the purpose of those around you and God's true characteristics properly. So that you can be exactly who you're supposed to be. Fulfill your destiny in this earth by perceiving yourself properly. It comes back to that. The essence of being filled with the Spirit. That above pretty much anything else is the most important thing. Because it's the Spirit of God that will lead you into all truth. As Jesus said in John, recorded in the Gospel of John. The Spirit of God will lead you into all truth. He said, I got a whole bunch of stuff that I want to tell you, but you can't handle it right now. But when the Spirit of God comes, the Spirit of God will lead you into all truth and remind you of what I said to you. The Spirit will lead you into all truth. So we need to be deeply connected in the Spirit. Constantly available. Saying, Lord, how do you see this? What should my perception be? Reaching out with our spiritual sense into this world instead of relying on our five senses. That's what was considered or called, characterized as blindness in the garden. When Adam and Eve disobeyed that one command and literally they saw that tree as making them wise, but it was knowledge. When you go after knowledge, just the fact gathering information, instead of relying on the author of wisdom, you become blinded to the truth of what's really going on. And it says their eyes were opened. And what it really means was their physical eyes were now opened and their spiritual eyes were closed. And when God came walking through the garden with Adam, it wasn't that God didn't know exactly where Adam was. He said, where are you? And what God was saying is, where is the person that I created? Because that image has been distorted, and I no longer see what I created. It's been distorted. It's been corrupted. And they knew it because they tried to cover themselves. They saw themselves as naked. Well, they were naked beforehand. What was the problem? They were clothed in the glory of God and saw in the Spirit. And when they disobeyed, they chose to be unclothed. They didn't realize that was going on, but he tried to warn them. And they were deceived into it. So we'll get into more about perception. And we'll tie back into a lot of things that I've already taught you about critical thinking, things like that. Many of those the other series. And you know, through all of these teachings, the fundamental element is purpose through relationship. Over and over again. Purpose through relationship.